A stormy, lightning day, so I'm not sure my lighting is right here, but we'll do the best we can. This is a section on Spain and France in the New World because the rest of the course is on the English settlers since America was settled by the English. But it's very interesting to look at the comparison to the French and Spanish, who also settled the New World almost exactly at the same time. And then we spend the rest of the course on the English. So I am in the first file, early exploration, and we are down in slides number 36 to 41 are Spain, and then France to the end of the file. So first I'm going to talk about New Spain. I think the easiest way to do this with all three different groups of colonists was to do the old what is it called? The old newspaper system of who, what, when, where, why, and how. So I'm going to start with Spain since they were first. They were 100 years head start over the French and the English. So the when, of course, with Spain is 1492 when Columbus sailed the ocean blue. That's an easy one. We talked about why 1492, because Spain now has the time and the energy to do things other than defeat the Moors and kick them out. Very quickly, Spain spread throughout Central and South America and also into North America quite a bit. So 1492 is when she starts. I will never ask you a date at all. There are Spanish in Santa Fe in 1609, which is almost exactly when Jamestown is founded. So at the other end of what is now the United States, the Spanish are already there. By the 1770s, they are all the way up into Northern California, but pretty much on the fringes of North America, in Texas, in Florida, in Louisiana a little bit, in New Mexico along the Rio Grande and up the Pacific coast, but almost nothing in the interior, but a very quick expansion. The who is a very large number. In the first 150 years that the Spanish are here, almost 500,000 come from Spain, which first of all tells you something about what conditions were in Spain, that many people were willing to leave and take a dangerous voyage to an unknown land. But the other part of it is this is a huge impact. You have 500,000 people coming. The French and the English came in tiny little groups for a long time. One writer in Seville looked around and said, Seville is depopulated. Everybody has gone to America. The type of Spaniards that come, not surprisingly, a whole lot of young males. Women didn't come very often. In the first 150 years, maybe 10% of the colonists are women. And they come quickly and they come in huge numbers. Columbus's first trip, he has, 50 guys and 3 little ships. The second voyage, the second trip he makes, he has 17 ships with 1,200 colonists. And he made additional voyages, and they begin to flood into Central and South America. Most of these young males have as an occupation the military. They are soldiers. The technical term for their leaders, the military officers, was conquistadors, which we all know about. There are also a very large number of priests and religious personnel, priests, missionaries, lay people that worked for the church as well. And then the usual amount of merchants and government officials, but largely males. Why are they here? As the Spanish said, gold, glory, and God, not necessarily in that order. One monarch, this is a quote, one empire, one world. The goal, of course, was that everything would be under the control of the King of Spain. It is the first large kingdom in Europe, so they just kept thinking about going. Cortez himself, as he conquers Mexico, this is a quote from Cortez, "We came to serve God," he's a good Catholic, "and also to get rich." It was pretty clear why they were here. Again from Cortez, "We Spanish have a sickness of the heart only gold can cure." And they found it. They happened to hit an area that had a lot of gold. If you look at a topo map from Alaska all the way down the Pacific coast, through British Columbia, through the Cascades and the Rocky Mountains on the western part of America, all the way down the coast of Mexico, central Mexico, the mountains in central Mexico, down through South America. This is the same chain of mountains, the same geological type, and they are covered full of gold and silver deposits. Spain found it the minute they heard that there was gold and silver, that the Aztecs had it. They were after them and kept looking. Once they found huge numbers of gold and silver ornaments, they kept looking and eventually found a whole lot more in Peru with the Inca. So Spain is sending, for the first 150 years, over 2,000 pounds of gold a year, plus much more silver. Gold and silver are found together, but always more silver than gold. Over the first 150 years, 181 tons of gold was sent to Europe from New Spain, and 16,000 tons of silver. This is half of the world's gold and silver was brought into Spain in that short amount of time. Immediate effect, of course, is Spain became incredibly wealthy and became a world power almost overnight. The slide that I have, San Luis Potosi, is a drawing at the time of the richest mine in the world at the time, and is still producing. 500 years later, they are still pulling gold and silver out of this mine. They found veins of pure gold and silver, 13 feet wide, 300 feet long, 50% pure. In other words, pretty much just pure gold and silver. The Indians, Native Americans, had been mining it before. The Spanish turned it into an industrial production. Within a few years after the Spanish conquest, 120,000 people were living in the town at the base of the mine. This is more people than lived in London or Paris at the time. It was a huge operation. The downside of that, of course, is who are they using for mining labor? Native Americans. Average lifespan in the mines in Mexico, we have some statistics, was about 3 years. So they constantly need a new supply of native labor. This brings up the question, besides the Columbian exchange and the 90% death rate, is what do we do about this? What do we do about monuments in the United States? What they do in the rest of the world is their problem, but what do we do about them in the United States? Monuments to Spanish explorers. That's what I would like to discuss in our next Collaborate session. Great explorations, there's no question about it. On the other hand, what did they introduce when they got there? It's not an easy issue to deal with. 400 mines in Mexico, what is now Mexico today, alone. No animal labor, all slave labor. The Americas, Native Americans, had some forms of slavery, but much milder, and certainly not the kind of slave labor that the Spanish introduced, because this was a big, big business. When they found the gold, they also introduced a new system. They introduced, not surprisingly, the same system that they had in Spain, which was basically feudalism. Because there were very few women brought, immediately the first question of any Spanish male getting off the boat was, where's the native women? And within 20 years, you have in New Spain, in Central and South America, a completely mixed race class of people. And if you look at slide number 39, within 100 years, you have a very complicated class or caste, really a caste system that people are born into. The difference was there was some flexibility. You could move into and out of your class. You could marry up or down. If you became very wealthy by whatever means, you could move up, or if you lost your money, you would move down. But most of it was by race, and they had all different combinations. When African slaves are brought, then it's even more complicated, and it's three-way mixes. But from the beginning, racial knowledge was important, but very flexible, because there was intermarriage on a huge scale from almost the first year they are there. When Cortez is conquering Mexico, he is having an affair with an Aztec princess at the same time. So this went on from almost the first day. Native Americans had to adopt Spanish culture. The Spaniards insisted that they become Catholic and that they adopt Spanish ways to some degree. For one thing, dropping polygamy, although, of course, many of the Spanish were, and dressing in European dress, et cetera, et cetera. They blended both cultures, but they had to adopt at least some of the Spanish culture. This is organized warfare on a grand scale. Cortez came with 600 men and 16 horses and conquered the Aztec Empire, which was about 250,000 in the Valley of Mexico City. Pizarro had 180 men and conquered the Inca Empire with 100,000 warriors against them. How did they do this? Guns, germs, and steel. Better equipment, better weapons. A key factor was the horses, which Native Americans had never seen and were largely terrified of, and of course the armor, which was pretty impregnable to Native American weapons. Cortez, again, got a lot of quotes from Cortez. Cortez said, after God, he was a good Catholic, we owe our victory to the horses. And he's not far from right. It was pretty accurate. The requirement, literally the requirement in any new tribe that the Spanish meant was, number one, to accept Christianity. If you accepted Christianity, you are taken in, you were treated with some legal rights, you were considered part of the Spanish Empire. If you resisted conversion, you were a savage and could be slaughtered without any problem. And tens of thousands were slaughtered, hundreds of thousands probably. We don't even know. They didn't even keep good records of it. And mainly just horrible methods of slaughtering as well. The Spanish had war dogs, which they turned loose on Native Americans to tear them limb from limb. Just total slaughter. If you converted to Christianity, you had some legal rights. You had a soul, according to the Spanish. If you didn't, you had no soul. You were like an animal and could be slaughtered like an animal. The Spanish had some slavery. When they came, they created much more. They called it just war. This is a just as opposed to an unjust war. Slaves weren't even taxed in the Spanish Empire. Cattle were taxed. So cattle in many cases were more valuable than slaves. But this is a flexible system. They set up what they knew in the past. And there's a slide there of an encomienda, which was a feudal system straight from Spain of a wealthy man who was given a large estate by the king in gratitude for conquering some native territory. And on this, he created basically a feudal system of a wealthy lord who had a lot of Native American laborers underneath him. Same thing with the missions, and we know the missions from San Antonio, which we've always seen. It's the same kind of a system, a small group of religious leaders in control of a large area, and the workforce is Native Americans. What do Native Americans get out of it? They get protection, and they get some basic requirements, food, shelter, clothing, etc. So this is a system they're recreating from Spain. Many of the kings for a long time tried to not only ban slavery, but also to protect Native Americans. In 1542, the king passed a law: no Indian can be made into a slave under any circumstances. Also, a law passed shortly after that: no Indian shall be whipped or beaten. Spain is a long way from the New World. There aren't complete records kept, and for a long time, nobody knows what's going on. So did this all happen? Absolutely. The Pope in 1537 passed a ruling that said that Native Americans were, and I'm quoting the Pope, true men. They were not animals. And shortly after, there were new laws that were supposed to protect Native Americans, protect their property, and their customs, except for their religion. They were supposed to be Catholic. So if you were Christian and accepted the rule of the Spanish government, you had some legal rights. And unlike Native Americans in the English colonies, you could go to court. There were special lawyers that would actually sue if you were treated like a slave. And in these lawsuits, these Native American slaves often won their freedom. So you had legal rights. You could attend any of the 23 universities throughout the Americas. They were open to all combinations of mixed races and Native Americans. You could go to any of the Spanish hospitals. So there was an attempt made to protect rights of Native Americans, but again, it's a long way away. They could also vote, and there were no property requirements on voting as well. Unfortunately, what we remember from Spain is the Black Legend of Spain. We see it through English eyes. The English and the Dutch were Protestants. Spain was strongly Catholic. They are also in economic competition with each other. So there is a book published in Britain early in the 1600s, and the title of the book is, I'm quoting, "A faithful narrative of the horrid massacres, butcheries, and all means of cruelty that hell and malice could invent committed by the Popish Spanish." That was the title. The book didn't get any better as you went along. And it basically chronicled all of the slaughters in the Spanish conquest. Hush! That's the dog. Is it true? Most of it was true. What it omits is some of the rest of it, like the legal rights of Native Americans and intermarriage with Spaniards. Cromwell, Prime Minister of England, 1656, Spain is, quote, "an enemy abroad who is the head of the Pope's interest, the head of the anti-Christian interest." What religion is Spain? She is Catholic. The English are Protestant, and they see each other as non-Christians, as enemies. So you have to remember, when you're seeing the Spanish, you are seeing it through English eyes. The atrocities, as far as we know, absolutely true, but there are other parts of it as well. The king is very interested in keeping track of everything that's going on. If you're ever in Seville, there is this huge 5-story building in the middle of town called the Archive of the Indies, and it is basically open to the public. It's amazing because there are documents that Columbus wrote that are in there. There are maps that Columbus and other explorers drew, and you can actually see his handwriting and his maps in there. The king was very interested, very on top of the Spanish colonies, because he got a 20% cut of any of the gold and silver that was sent to Spain. So the profit motive is huge in the Spanish colonies. New France is a different story. The when is 1608, the first settlement in Quebec, in southern Canada, eastern Canada. That is only 1 year off from Jamestown. So the English and French come almost simultaneously. 1608 is also the beginning of what we call today the Little Ice Age, which was caused by volcanic eruptions. There were crop failures, there were agricultural problems, very cold weather all over Europe. One English writer said this year was more winter than summer. And also in the Americas. So not only is Canada cold today, it was a whole lot colder then. This was the Little Ice Age. Where do they come? They followed the St. Lawrence Seaway down all the way through the Great Lakes into the Mississippi River and the Ohio Valley, but for a long time they are stuck in Quebec and Montreal at the bottom of the St. Lawrence Seaway. They are also in Florida. There was a French settlement in Florida. They are Catholic. France is Catholic at the time, and only Catholics were allowed to come. So there were French Protestants. They tried a settlement in Florida, but they were massacred by the Spanish, who didn't want them there. One of the settlers there, who was growing tobacco and sent some back to France, this is an interesting sidelight, whose name was Jean Nicot. So nicotine comes from one of the early French settlers in Florida who disappeared, were massacred by the Spanish. Who is coming? Very few. As opposed to the Spanish, very few come to New France. In 100 years, you only have 15,000. Even by the time it falls to the British, you have less than 75,000. They are also, again, largely single young males, very few women, but not so many soldiers. A good number of priests and missionaries, mainly traders and merchants, with some soldiers. There is no gold. Why are they there? The Spanish found gold. Why isn't there gold in Canada? Let's check around. They found none. Unfortunately, they were about 200 years too early. There's lots of gold in Canada, but not on that side of Canada and not that early. Can't grow much crops in Canada, but they do find a different kind of fur, a different kind of gold, and that is fur, particularly beaver fur. What is so special? I mean, cold weather, any animal grows a heavy coat, so you had very good furs that came out of Canada, all kinds of furs. But beaver particularly, if you think about beaver, there are none in Europe, first of all. They are one of the few animals that lives underwater, one of the few mammals that has a coat of fur. And it is one of the few waterproof furs. So the French figured out from the Native Americans, here's a very valuable fur. What did they do with it? They didn't take the pelt of the beaver, but they scraped the hair off, and the hair was very waterproof and would keep its shape. And they would felt it or press it into a kind of cloth. The Lapps in Scandinavia still do this with reindeer hair, and it's very waterproof and very insulating. So why are they there? There's no minerals, but they do have furs. They're also looking for the same thing the Spanish were, which is a northwest passage, a passage across the continent to get to Asia in a much shorter route than going around the tip of South America, which is controlled by the Spanish, or the tip of Africa, the Horn of Africa. Couldn't go south because it's all Spanish, so the French went north, looking for a northwest passage. And people kept looking for 200 years. You can see on a later slide there what happened to them. You can't get across Canada by water. You can't get west by water until today. Today there is an actual water northwest passage. In the beginning, no, it was completely iced. Remember, it's the little ice age. The system the French used was the flip side of the Spanish. In the Spanish colonies, Indians had to become like Spaniards. In French Canada, the French went native. They became like the Indians. They adapted to their environment. They lived with native tribes. They learned native languages. They adopted the customs. They learned how to survive in the woods, and they went native. First of all, how do you catch a beaver? You plant a trap. I'm not going to get into it. It's really gruesome. But you chain a trap underground. You bait it with a scent. The beaver crawls in, puts his paw in there. He's caught, and he drowns. So if you are going to be collecting beaver furs, you are up to your waist in ice cold water for days on end, which is not a good job description. So they figured out very quickly the way to do this was to have Native Americans do it and trade with the Native Americans for steel and beads and guns later on and things that Native Americans wanted from European society. Because there are so few women, like the Spanish, again, the French immediately intermarry with Native Americans, and they had a vested interest in adopting native ways to expand the fur trade. As one French trapper said, we sought to appease them. We wanted to please the Indians. They have to because they're partners in the trade. They were so good at this and so adapted to Native American societies that later on, when the English wanted to make treaties with the Indians or deal with them in any way, they would hire the French to do the negotiating. And the Indians knew the French were much better to them than the English were as well. The king, not terribly interested like the Spanish king, because there's not that much revenue coming in. Furs were taxed, but at a much lower rate. And the King of France was not that on top of his American colonies. He was busy with wine, women, and song, and there wasn't as much money to be made. So much looser control. Close to 15 million beaver a year, beaver pelts, were sent to France from Canada. 15 million They were almost exterminated, not quite, but almost exterminated. So this is a different civilization than the Spanish. Number one, there aren't that many. Number two, you have to spread out and trade. Within 100 years, as you can see on the map, slide number 44, the French had expanded all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. Everything in blue was claimed for the King of France. How did they do this? Unlike the Spanish, who went out in large expeditions with hundreds of thousands, usually, of Native American porters and bearers, and hundreds of Spanish, the French, 2 guys in a canoe. And it's amazing to read some of their stories. 2 guys in a canoe, usually with an Indian guide, would be gone for 2 or 3 years. They explored all the way down almost to the Gulf of Mexico and the Mississippi, down the Ohio. They explored all the waterways looking for new fur territory. They may come back or they may not. 2 names that are important in Canadian history and North American history: Pierre Radisson. You know Radisson from the hotels. Why was this huge chain of hotels founded after him? He was a great traveler. And his story is very Canadian. He comes to Canada at the age of 10. He is captured and raised in a Mohawk village. He learns Indian ways. He learns how to survive in the woods. He's very resourceful. He learns several Indian languages. He becomes a great fur trader later on, and he is the founder of the Hudson's Bay Company, which is still in existence and one of the largest commercial companies in the world. It was the fur trading company for 200 years. Famous for 2 reasons. He explored into the Great Lakes, one of the first white men, Europeans, to be in that area, and definitely the first European to reach Hudson's Bay overland from the St. Lawrence Seaway, from Quebec and Montreal. Not only did he go once, he made 7 trips overland through the woods, usually by canoe, to Hudson's Bay, and claimed it for the French. He also made, amazingly enough, 24 trips back and forth along the Atlantic. This is a time when if you made 1 trip, you got down on your knees and you thank God that you survived. Radisson made 24 and ended up dying of old age in his sleep in Quebec later on. There's a lot of fishy things about him. We know he was selling French political secrets to the English. He was selling English secrets to the French. He's suspected of being at least a double agent, probably a triple agent, and was collecting money from both sides. And oddly enough, dies in his sleep of old age. The other key figure is Pierre d'Iberville, and this is a name Texans should know, and most of them don't. He also comes to Canada at the age of 11, is raised largely with Native Americans. There are 11 brothers in the d'Iberville family. I think there were 1 or 2 sisters. And this is the most famous family in Canadian history. All of them fought for France against the English. This is later on in the late 1600s and early 1700s. 4 of his brothers were killed in battle. Pierre d'Iberville fought to defend French territory against the English in a number of battles, never injured, never lost a conflict. They all became important fur traders. He is the man who keeps the claims to Hudson's Bay. Radisson explored Hudson's Bay. D'Iberville kept Hudson's Bay for the French. How did he do this? He had a small, not a very large warship, a small warship that had a grand total of 2 cannon up in Hudson's Bay. Around the bend, up in Hudson's Bay, separated from everybody else, come 3 British warships. British warships at the time had anything from 50 to 200 cannon. These were smaller ones, so each of these ships has about 50 cannon. And here's Pierre d'Iberville with his much smaller boat with 2 cannon. I would have turned around and run away as fast as I could. Pierre d'Iberville turns his boat around and charges the 3 British warships. He cripples 2 of them, who later sink. He did not kill the men. The 3rd boat, he also handicaps and cripples. They picked up the men from the 2 sinking ships, and he lets them go on their way, but he keeps Hudson's Bay for the French. But the French king is still worried about English and also some Spanish, and he knows the English have their eyes on the southern part of North America. So the French had sent an expedition under La Salle to Matagorda Bay in Texas. which was destroyed. La Salle failed. The expedition disappears. We have recently found the boat about 20 years ago, and it is in a museum today. But the French were never found again, probably killed by Native Americans. So the king wants to make sure that this part of North America is also French territory. They knew that there was a great river that ended in the Gulf of Mexico, and they had explored most of the way down the Mississippi, but not all the way. So he sends one of his best captains, Pierre d'Iberville, who sails out of Quebec, down through the Atlantic, up through the Gulf of Mexico, who pokes around and finds the mouth of the Mississippi. So he is the founder of the city he built there, New Orleans, after the Duke of Orleans, the King of France. In 1718, New Orleans is founded. He goes up the Mississippi and founds another great city in Louisiana, Baton Rouge, which means red stick, after the red clubs that the Indians carried at the time. Later captured Pensacola, Florida. That's my timer, sorry. And becomes one of the great figures in American history as well. So New Orleans becomes French territory. You can see on that last slide, Lake Pontchartrain is also part of his explorations. It is d'Iberville who claimed both ends of the Mississippi for France and united French territory in North America. So French and Spanish set up very different systems. They both have the same goal. How do we make money from the Americas? But very different ways of doing this. The rest of the course, of course, will be what the English did. Stay safe out there.